Butterfly Effect. Butterfly Effect.
শুনছো কালার্স এফএম 101.6 আর ঘড়িতে সময় বাজে 6টা। চলে আসলাম কমিকবাজ নিয়ে, আবারও নতুন একটা সপ্তাহ শুরু হয়ে গেল এবং তাসিন ভাই আবারও চলে আসলো কমিকবাজি করতে পুরো এক সপ্তাহ পরে। কেমন আছো তাসিন ভাই?
ভালো আছি। হ্যালো এভরিওয়ান, আমরা কিন্তু আজকে খুবই বেশি এক্সাইটেড। আজকে একটা ব্যাপারে
এক্সাইটেড প্লাস নার্ভাস এট দ্য সেম টাইম।
হ্যাঁ, অহনা আর আমি একটু আগেই চিন্তা করছিলাম যে এটা যে আমাদের যারা লিসনার্স তারা শুনেও কিন্তু নিশ্চয়ই অনেক খুশি হয়ে যাবেন আমরা আজ যাকে নিয়ে এসেছি।
একদম, মানে it's a surprise for everyone, and today we have a very special guest with us and we are honored to have him right now in Colors FM 101.6. So Tasin bhai, would you do the honor of introducing him?
Thank you so much, Ahana. Well, we talk about pop culture and comics and superheroes and whatnot in this show.
Right.
But today we are focusing on the academic aspect of it. We have known about comic studies and everything, but have we ever been able to delve into it properly? We've had teachers from Bangladesh, lecturers from Bangladesh, but we see that people from Europe and America have taken it to new levels. They've come up with journals, they analyze, they study and do whatnot with comics. And we were wondering whether we could delve into it, whether we could talk about it.
Exactly.
And we are so lucky to have Professor John A. Lent with us here.
Welcome to Colors FM 101.6. How does it feel to be with us?
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're actually very excited to have you here. And we're looking forward to the interview and getting to know you as a person and as your profession as well. So let's start the interview.
Actually, Professor John A. Lent has been a professor in Temple University, and he is also the founder and editor of one of the top journals, comic journals in America. That is the International Journal of Comic Art.
Right.
So, Professor,
IJOCA.
would you please tell us about that? How did it all start, about comics and your interest in this comic studies field?
How much time do you have? Because I've been interested in it for a long time. My father was a railroader, but he always came up with a lot of different sayings. And as a kid, I thought he was very smart for an 8th grade educated man. And then later on, I found out many of those things he got from the newspaper comic strips, many of the idioms he was using. So I grew up in a family where my father was a very avid reader of newspaper comics, and so was I. And as a child, I did not read comic books because this was a time of Frederick Wortham, but it was also the 1940s, and the comic books were not very much available where I was. I was in a very small town. Okay. The comic books were probably going to the GIs, to the soldiers overseas. Right. That's what built the American comic book industry, the billions of copies that were going overseas to the soldiers. Okay. And then in 1963, I was working on a PhD, and I wanted to see, as Wortham and others were saying, whether comic books had negative effects on children. And I looked at 4th graders because 4th graders were the most avid readers. Right. And I gave one group a psychological test to take without reading a comic. It was an experimental group. Also, the other group saw what was a violent comic book. I didn't get very many results from it. First of all, it was not a big enough study. And secondly, 4th graders were smarter than I was because they put me on any way they could. I would say one question was, how many comic books do you read a week? 4,361.
Wow.
They made up numbers.
They just came up with 4,321.
Yeah, right. But then throughout the 70s, I had some interest, but I really developed an interest in the 1980s.
About comic studies.
About comic studies because there was nothing, virtually nothing. There were a few things, but virtually nothing on comic scholarship. There was a lot of snobbery in academia, that this did not fit in academia. But they also had said the same about television and cinema. So, it's just...
You knew they would come around after some time.
Right. So in 1986, a cartoonist friend from Hungary and I started a cartoon magazine called Witty World. And this was published 21 issues plus 10 bulletins. It's a very high-quality magazine, and, you know, the quality of paper, the color, and everything. And this
You
was
started then back in 1986.
We started in 86,
The seminal year for comics.
Huh?
Watchmen and all those.
Oh,
the seminal year for comics.
Yeah. But we were concentrating a lot on international cartoons and comics. Not just comics, but cartoons, too.
Okay. Since you had a bigger influence coming from the strips as well, you grew up reading all those syndicated ones.
Right.
Did you ever come across this, I'm sure you have, about the things that were prior to the comics, the magazines?
The pulp magazines,
yes. The pulp ones, yes.
Yeah, sure.
Did you have any influence from those pulps?
No, because I grew up in a very, very, very poor community. This was a coal mining community. People didn't have money for that, or, you know, there weren't that many comic books available. And by the time I could see them, I think we had to sneak them from my mother, for instance, because she was a very devoted Roman Catholic, and the Roman Catholics were saying that you should not read comic books because they, you know, caused juvenile delinquency and things of that sort. The church had its own set of comic books. Treasure Island, I think it was called.
That's interesting. I didn't know about that.
Even I didn't know about that.
Yeah. So...
and then you had Frederick Wertham to deal with.
Yeah, well, I didn't know who he was at the time, but obviously he was behind the scene in the late 40s and early 50s.
For our listeners, Frederick Wertham is the person who came up with the book called Seduction of the Innocent, which actually branded comic books to be off limits for children.
Right.
They had, according to Wertham, it had some permanent side effects on the psyche of the children.
Right.
And he actually could not promote it for children. He actually won. They came out with the Comics Code Authority, right?
Right. Right.
So it's good that you actually you were there back then. You knew exactly what things were happening. That you were a witness to all that.
Right.
We actually talked about these things in our show, but it's great to have someone who has actually witnessed all those things.
Exactly.
You can say that these things happened. This is true. This is not true. And all that.
Oh, sure. They were burning comic books. They were collecting comic books. You know, the church and others were collecting comic books and then having mass burnings of them.
Wow.
Yeah,
I'm sure if they had YouTube back then they would have had videos of those.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So I have a question for Dr. Lent, and that is, what actually, interested you to come towards this sector at that time? Like you said that, people were actually reading it, but then the supply wasn't maybe as much. So what actually interested you to get into this sector?
Into the sector of studies?
Comic studies.
Yes. I think in my career, I was playing a role of filling gaps.
Okay.
When I saw gaps, I thought, I'm going to try and learn as much as I can and
so
fill it. Because in the 60s, for instance, when I was doing graduate work, there was there wasn't anything written on Asian mass media. I'm talking about broadcasting and newspapers. You look at the political science, history books, etc., that talked about Asia, they didn't mention mass media. They didn't think it was important enough.
Right.
And so when I first came to Asia in '64 for a year on a Fulbright, then I wrote a book on the history of the Philippine mass media. And I found there was a lot of information to be gathered. And so I filled that gap. And then over the years, I also wrote or compiled the first books in English on Asian broadcasting, Asian popular culture, Asian animation, Asian comics, etc. And also on the Caribbean, because I realized in 1968, my former wife and I and a couple of our kids, they were babies then, went on a vacation in the Caribbean. And after one day, I was bored. because I don't like to lie on the beach. It doesn't excite me to lie on a beach and get sand on me and then put oil on me and then the sand collects onto the oil. That didn't seem like something I wanted to enjoy.
Right.
So while they were on a beach, I went into the town and started interviewing editors and broadcasters.
Oh, wow.
And when I came back and looked for material, there wasn't anything. And so I then wrote the first book on the Commonwealth Caribbean and their mass media. So that's what I saw this gap. And with Witty World, we were starting to fill, but it wasn't just academic. And then I was writing articles. I came to Asia. I interviewed in Asia in the late 80s. And then in 92, I took over a month and went to 6 countries of Asia and interviewed as many cartoonists and animators as I could.
So which countries did you go to back then?
The first year I went to South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore.
Wow.
And then the second year, I decided I would go for 50 or more days. And that time I started out in India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and then Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, China, etc.
You've
Wow.
covered
And the
all
list
the
goes
major
on.
zones.
Yeah.
And he actually covered Bangladesh back then.
Yeah, I was here in
That's interesting.
93, and so that's when, and I had a contract in 1992 with the publisher to do a book on Asian comics. I finally finished it, and it was published in 2015. It took 23 years for me.
Whoa.
23
Because-
years of
Actually, 'cause,
research.
you know,
But
I was
also-
counting. I was born on 92. And 2015 is just last year.
But anyway, in the preface to that book, I said that only the pyramids took longer than my doing that book. So, but yeah, and all during that time, I was traveling all over the world and
Right.
interviewing cartoonists.
So you've been to so many countries and so many different cultures you've seen. So where did you actually, do you remember any noticeable, stories or something related to comic, of course, or pop culture from any of the countries?
Well, yeah, there are many of them. I mean, just looking at the day jobs that the cartoonists have had in various countries. You know, there was one country I interviewed, there was a man who ferried the boats across the river. That was his job, and then he cartooned at other times. And there was a psychiatrist and, all types of people, architects and one boxer. So there were a lot of interesting people. There were a lot of interesting incidents. In the small island of Curacao, which is a Dutch island in the Caribbean.
Right.
There was a cartoonist. When I was there, he had been drawing cartoons for 20 years, and no one knew who he was. So I didn't interview him because I wasn't supposed to know who he was. And the only one who knew who he was the editor of the paper. And they would meet at different secret places, and he would hand in his cartoons.
Right.
Now, why would he do that? Well, Curacao is a small island, you see, and so they were trying to protect him, that he wouldn't get a lot of noise from people when he might attack the government or social issues. So there are those
He
types
did it
of...
anonymously throughout.
Yeah, right. I don't know how long he lasted after that, but it was 20 years when I heard about him, and so there were many stories like that. The way people gathered money to start comics. In Bangladesh, Haroon told me that he started Cartoon Magazine back. This was in 1980, 2 years after Unmad. And he said that the way he gathered money was he bought gold or jewels, I think in Bangladesh, and then sold them in another country at a higher price. And that money then he used to start his cartoon magazine. So there are many stories like that, and there are many more that need to be told.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Sir, I would like to know about this thing that here, right now, you're here to do research on your next book, I presume, right?
Right.
What's that book about?
Well, I've done a book on Asian comics, one on Asian animation. This book's on Asian political cartoons.
Okay.
So I've interviewed about 6 years ago in India, and I've been interviewing in China, more recently, Hong Kong, and last week I was in Malaysia, and after I leave here, I'm going to Nepal to interview
Wow.
political cartoonists, and then next year I will go to a number of other countries.
Asian countries.
Yes, so it's political cartoons.
Wow.
So you've covered so many countries. I'm sure you've come across so many comics, and different continents might have different types of comics, would cover different genres and all that. Could you tell us a bit, what is it like in the other continents from where we've not had the experience of comics? Let's say we have not got any I have personally not read any comics from Africa. I would like to know what it's like, if you have ever been to Africa, or in your journal, people, I'm sure from Africa, they've come up with their papers as well. So what is it like in Asia, in Africa, in Australia, or South America, all those comics?
Well, I've been to Africa. I've been to South Africa a number of times. I've been to Botswana, Egypt, Kenya, Cameroon. They're different in each of those places. In Kenya, for instance, the longest-running comic was the same type of comic you would see in different other countries, and that is mainly boy characters. The characters that were reflecting the society. A lot of those type.
Non-superhero type, I guess.
No, they have superhero too. Yeah, they had one in Nigeria. It's no longer around, but I think it was called Power Man. I forget now.
Okay.
But he was, all the things Superman was.
Okay.
But in addition to that, he was also a big hit with many women. So that's how he
okay.
differed from Superman. He was a womanizer too.
The Batman version of Superman.
Yeah, right. So different countries have their superheroes, but they also have other types of comics. And in China, for instance, they were called lianhuanhua, but they weren't comics in our sense. These were books that would be maybe 7 inches by 3 inches. Rectangular, and each page would be an illustration.
Single panel ones.
Yeah, and a story, and then the text would be at the bottom, not in balloons.
Oh, it's more like illustrated books, I guess.
But they call them picture books, but it was also their equivalent of comics.
That's the only thing that they offer.
Well, no, that was before. Now, in the last few years, they have what are called Zin Manhwa. Manhwa means cartoon, so these are new comics, and they're influenced by the West. And there are a number of those now. There's one company, the first or second largest in the country, and they are producing 3 types of comics. One type is imitating Japanese manga. Another type is Buddhist comics for the Buddhist community. And the third one was using wash ink, traditional Chinese painting. Brush painting type, beautiful comics that they do. And the owner of that told me that surprisingly, probably for most people, the Japanese were not the most popular. The Japanese comics weren't. He said the wash ink ones were.
In China?
In China, yeah.
Wow. That's
so
interesting.
very different. In Sri Lanka, they were called comics papers. They came out once a week. Used to be they had 7 or 8 of them. There are probably very few left now. There were 16 pages, tabloid size, on newsprint in color.
Okay.
And besides the cover, you had 15 different stories. So 15 different people, artists, created 15 different stories that were serialized. And, so you had to buy it every week to keep up with the 15 different stories.
Whoa, very interesting concept. Where every week you would have a fresh writer taking over, maybe.
No, it wasn't fresh. It was the same. Like on page 2, it would be one cartoonist and writer doing that story.
Okay.
And next week,
It would be like
they
you would
do
continue the story next
continue
week.
that
Okay.
story, and someone else would continue
Right.
another story.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And how's actually the demand there? Like here, people are still getting used to pop culture. People are still getting used to comics. So what's the scene over there, like in different countries? Like you just mentioned Sri Lanka, let's say, for example.
It varies. In some countries, in a number of countries, the new media have hurt the print comics. In Sri Lanka, I was told that when television was introduced to Sri Lanka, the comics readership dropped.
Right.
And of course, other new media after that. But in some places, there's been a revival. In Indonesia, there's a revival. I would say in Thailand, there's a revival of the comics. In Malaysia, there are some very strong comic book companies now that are bringing out comics.
Okay.
There are a lot of independent comics coming out in different countries now, too.
Right.
Sir, we know that you're the founder and editor of the International Journal of Comic Art.
Right.
So tell us about its history. How did you come up with this idea of coming up with this journal? And at a time when there probably were not many journals available back then.
At that time, there was no journal, and that's why I started it. I told you earlier, my idea was always to fill in research gaps.
Right.
And I was going to conferences in the States where the young comic scholars, who are now middle-aged comic scholars, in the 1990s kept lamenting the fact we did not have a journal. And they would talk about it would take $20,000 to run a journal every issue and all that sort of thing. And I took that as a challenge. And so in 1998, I was at this conference I went to every year, and I handed out like a mimeograph sheet of paper saying there's now a journal in comic art. And I put it down as the International Journal of Comic Art. And I put on there if you want to subscribe, and all that, and send articles. And, in the beginning, the first 2 issues the first issue I paid for, the second issue I paid a lot of it, but the subscriptions started coming in.
Right.
And when they came in, eventually they not over a long time, but rather short time, because there was no such journal.
Of course.
And then I was getting a number of subscriptions through the subscription agencies.
Right.
They deal with the libraries.
Right.
And that's what keeps the journal alive, the library. And it's what keeps book publishers alive.
Right.
Everywhere. That's, they depend on those library sales. Some book publishers only come out with 250 copies of academic books with the idea that those will be bought up by the libraries. So I started it that way. The first issue, I promised 250 pages per issue. The first issue already was more than that. Okay. And, the biggest issue was almost 900 pages.
900 pages?
It comes out twice a year. I have subscriptions in probably, maybe 50 or more countries. So it's not a U.S. journal, it's an international journal.
Yes.
And, it's completely independent. Intellect Books in England offered to take it over. I could be the editor. They would not interfere with me. And they were going to give me $50,000 up front to, let them publish it. And I turned it down because I wanted to be independent. And By independent, I mean I don't have to answer to anyone.
Right.
I let it run as big as it's supposed to be, that issue. So it's always at least 620 or 630 pages twice a year. I have no limitations on number of illustrations. I use 250, 300 or more illustrations per issue.
Wow.
So that's what I mean by independent, and I don't want. I guess since growing up in the coal mining town, I've always had a sense I wanted to be independent.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, as much as a human being can be, and so that's basically the history of.
Whoa.
Well,
the
that's a
journal.
very inspirational journey that you're telling
Definitely.
us about. Now, sir,
Everything's done in my house. Yeah, I have a large
that's an
house.
added bonus.
But no, I do all the copy editing, which is quite a bit because
all
some are
600
written in.
pages and all those.
I do all the copy editing. I don't allow anyone to do that.
Whoa.
I have one assistant who, because I'm not a computer person, she types it into the computer.
Right.
I have someone who formats it free. So the labor, except for my assistant, is free. And when the issues come, they're brought to my house, and I get a couple former PhD students to help me package them.
Oh, wow.
It takes us most of a day, and when they're not available, I get my children and grandchildren to help me.
That's so nice.
And
Total family support.
yeah, it's just it's very independent. That's what it's all
Right.
about. Yeah.
So, like we just heard, that almost 50 countries contribute in IJOCA. So, which countries contribute the most, if you have to say? Like,
I would say, besides the United States, I would say China, quite a few articles. Brazil, quite a few articles from Brazil. From where else? Quite a few from Europe, but not as many as before, because since I started this now in the last 10 years or less, there are 4 or 5 journals that were started
There's one
in London.
particular
And,
European journal.
yeah, European journals, and people are submitting to them.
Of course.
But yeah, quite a few on India. We've had 2 or 3 on Bangladesh.
Right.
Yeah, I think 2.
In fact, that's what I was going to tell you, Ahona, that remember we had Mehdi Haq some years
Right.
back. Mehdi Haq was also somebody who sent and got his paper published in IJOCA. That happened last year, right, sir? Last year.
Maybe 2. Yes, last year. Right.
Right. So you've got contents from Bangladesh as well, contributions from Bangladesh in IJOCA. So tell us, now that you've come here after 93, this is the first time you've come here since 1993. So many things have changed, and now in Bangladesh we've got regular comic companies publishing regularly. Mighty Punch Studios, Dhaka Comics, and there's this Panjari publishers who actually publish in trade paperback formats every 6 months they come, or not on a monthly basis. So it's developing in our country as well, but basically this boom started from 2013 when Mighty Punch, Dhaka Comics started first, coming up with single issues. Then Mighty Punch started, and Panjari had been publishing from 2007 or 8 this trade paperbacks. So what do you think? Back in 1993 it was only Unmad, the satire magazine, and cartoon maybe. And now we've got all
Yeah,
these things.
in 93 there was Cartoon Magazine and Unmad. Both started within 2 years of each other. And there were some very small, 2 or 3 small comic books that were brought out by, I think, a man named Saeed Bari. And other than that, I couldn't find any comic books at that time.
Right.
And those ones I just mentioned, they were on newsprint.
Right.
Yeah.
And
now
not in
I'm
color
seeing,
as well.
Yeah, no color. But now I'm seeing high quality
Glossy paper.
glossy paper comic books here with full color and beautiful illustrations, very good layouts. So it's changed a lot. And you have Comic Fest here now. You have
Comic-Con,
Comic-Con.
right.
yeah, these types of things that you didn't have at that time.
And,
you have a
act-
comic book store too.
Right, and actually, if I remember it correctly, during the last Comic Con, that Unmat JCC Comic Con, there were 15,000 or something like that, similar number of people who had gone there. So you can see they're coming up from 8,000, 10,000, it's gradually increasing.
Yeah.
And people go and flock to the movie theaters to get the first day tickets of Batman vs. Superman or Civil War. I even could not get any tickets in one of the cineplexes, so I had to go to another one.
Yeah.
I have to ask Dr. Lentier
I
that.
know what you're gonna
Yeah,
ask.
exactly. Who is your favorite superhero?
I don't think I have a favorite now, but when I was a teenager,
Right.
I liked Captain Marvel.
Oh.
Now, it may be because someone in my town liked Captain Marvel because we didn't buy them; they were just passed on. So by the
right.
time we would get a comic book, it had no cover on it. Maybe the first page was missing, But then later I realized I liked Binder's work because there was in Captain Marvel, I don't know, some parody, I think. There was some, I thought, comedy because of the ridiculousness of some of it. And, and I think Otto
Binder.
He was putting that in there, I think.
He was doing everything for DC back then in the Silver Age, I guess.
Yeah.
Superman, Flash, and all those things.
Right.
He was doing all those.
Yeah.
Well, yes, Captain Marvel was very inspiring back then.
Yeah.
Sir, but I would like to ask you something about the Bangladeshi community. What do you have any particular message for the people who are reading comics or for people who are trying to come up with academic studies in comics? What should they do and where should we head towards?
Number one, I think that you have tremendous talent here from what I've seen in the last week or so. And this talent is not being seen worldwide. And as I told some of the cartoonists this week, there has to be more entries into international competitions.
Right.
Because first of all, they pay very well. If you win those prizes, they're thousands of dollars. Cartoonists here told me they don't have time to do that, and I said, well, take off, some time, or don't sleep much one night or something, and do it. Do an excellent one that you think would be it. So I think that's one thing that I would say, and more outside exposure, translation of some of the good ones into English and put them online or print. Look at the diaspora, the overseas Bangladesh people. That's another audience that you could be catering to. That's what Amartya Katha did in India. Anand Pai
Amar
was,
Chitra Katha, right.
yeah,
Right.
he was looking at also the international community of Indians because the overseas Indian families wanted to make sure the children, even though they weren't born in India, that they kept
should
some
know about
knowledge or
India,
learn
right.
some knowledge about their ancestors' home. So I would give that type of advice, and I think it's important to keep networking. I think there's a great network that started now among cartoonists here that was not here when I was here in '93.
Yes, that's true.
I think these are all things, and then keep keep encouraging people in academia, not just to study comics, that it's okay to study comics. It's not
simply children's book.
No, it's not an original sin or anything. So, do it. Because you have to make that breakthrough in academia.
That's right.
And I think that'll happen.
You would be happy to know, sir, that last year we actually had the first national conference on graphic demia. That was the first of its kind ever done in Bangladesh. And now we've had conferences where sequential arts panels were there this year as well. In fact, me and my wife, we took part in that. And it would go on continuously. Now they've come up groups of cartoonists, groups of artists. They have come up with different Facebook groups on Instagram, I guess. They're doing all these things. They're interacting all the time, moving to maybe going to the zoo or some other place, having all these trips, drawing and all those things. The artists are coming up, I guess. And what you're saying, that they have to concentrate their focus and network, international networking and all those things. I'm sure that would help our people and maybe our comic industry, development of that, because with artists only we can flourish as an industry. So we would focus on that as well.
And also those of you who are doing research, as I've been encouraging you and Arzu to submit your papers to the journal.
Yes,
and your previous guest from last week is studying transportation art.
Yes.
And I asked her also to submit an article because, all that is unique.
Yes,
the transportation art, a lot of that's comic art.
Yes, that's true. And in fact, rickshaw painting, the one that she was focusing on, that is actually something which is very similar to the Prisma effect which we witnessed some weeks ago on Facebook. People were coming up with profile pictures giving it the Prisma touch. But then again, we've had it always in our rickshaws. At the back of our rickshaws. But anyways, sir, thank you so much for your time. Just 6 months back, I could not have even dreamt of having Dr. John L. Lent here on our show.
And now Comicbaj has reached the international level.
Right. We've got the
We're just
founder
not
editor.
Bangladesh based. And we would love to have you back on our show sometime soon.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Sure. And next time you're going to have more and more comics. You're going to talk about Bangladeshi comics then.
All right.
Thank you so much.
That's the deal. So, yeah. Well, thank you. I've enjoyed, talking. And as a professor, you know that professors love to talk. They don't say anything, but they love to talk.
I'm married to a lecturer. I know about that.
Right. And thank you so much once again for coming to Colors FM 101.6. And everyone, I hope you guys enjoyed as well. তাসিন ভাই আবারও তোমার সাথে কথা হবে এক সপ্তাহ পর।
নিশ্চয়ই এক সপ্তাহ পরেই আমরা আসছি। ততদিন পর্যন্ত আমরা আছি আপনাদের সাথে, আরো মানুষ নিয়ে আসবো। Thank you so much, everyone.
Stay tuned and keep listening to Colors FM 101.6.
Colors FM 101.6